Wiltshire, England, 1837. The letter had arrived 3 days earlier, yet Juliet Weston could still feel the weight of it against her fingertips, as if the words had pressed invisible marks into her skin. She folded it once more, a gesture she had repeated so many times that the creases were beginning to soften, and tucked it into the pocket of her navy wool dress. Simple, yes, but well kept enough to lend her a semblance of order amid what remained of her life. Outside, the morning was cold, and a low mist clung to the fields surrounding the small property she had called home for the past 2 years. Years carved out through work and sacrifice, ever since the Western fortune had vanished with her father's final breath. Juliet looked through the fogged window. The carriage was waiting, black, imposing, marked by the golden crest she had recognized at once, the Colbornes. Her heart lurched, not with expectation, but with the sharp, familiar ache she had kept locked away with near-cruel precision for 12 long years. Joshua Colborne was coming for her. Not for her, never for her, but for the child. Anne slept in the makeshift cradle by the hearth, her fair curls scattered over the linen pillow. 3 years old, and no sign of the man who should have claimed her. Juliet pressed her lips together. She knew abandonment far too well. She knew the silence of men who chose convenience over courage, and Joshua Colborne had been the first to teach her that lesson. She brushed her fingers over Anne's forehead, feeling the warmth of the little girl against her own chilled skin. 3 intense months, months in which Juliet's entire world seemed to narrow to that room, that soft breath, that blind, innocent trust of someone who had not yet learned to fear. And now he was coming, to take her. To decide Anne's fate as if she were merely another Colborne obligation, and not a small, fragile life that had found refuge in Juliet's arms. Juliet closed her eyes. The letter had said only, "I will come for the child. Have her prepared for travel." No kindness, no explanation, only the cold command of a man who 12 years earlier had looked into her eyes during a London ball and then never returned. He had chosen another, married, been widowed. And now, for the first time in more than a decade, she would see him again, not as the girl she once was, but as the woman he had helped break and who survived in spite of it. If you too cherish period stories, those that whisper like old letters and echo like longing hearts, leave your like and subscribe to the Countess's Tales. Your support allows these narratives to cross oceans and reach more souls around the world. And before you go, tell me in the comments which city and country you're watching from. It's always enchanting to discover how far our stories travel. Juliet Weston had been raised to shine in ballrooms and to vanish from them without leaving a trace. With watchful blue eyes and dark chestnut hair always pinned into a modest bun, she learned French, the piano, and every refined grace expected of the daughter of a fallen baron. What she never learned was how to forget. At 16, during her first and only summer in London, she met Joshua Colborne. He was 22, heir to a viscountcy, and possessed that stern, arresting beauty that made mothers wary, and daughters drift closer all the same. Juliet, lonely and burdened with the weight of her family's hopes, loved him in silence. He danced with her twice, nothing more. During the second dance, when the quadrille drew them nearer, he had tilted his head just enough for only her to hear, and murmured, in a tone almost intimate, that her eyes were as calm and deep as the sea on a summer's day, and that he sincerely hoped that would not be the only summer he'd have the privilege of dancing with Miss Weston. For a hopeful young girl, 2 dances, and those words became an entire world. Not mere courtesy, promise. The first time anyone had truly seen her. The first time she allowed herself to believe she might be chosen. And then, without a word, Joshua disappeared. 5 months later, the papers announced his engagement to Lady Catherine Devereux, a duke's daughter. Juliet burned the letters she had never found the courage to send, and buried his name in the same quiet place where she kept the illusion that she had ever been more than a polite dance and words far too kind for such a young heart. Years passed. Her father died. The estate was sold. Juliet became a governess, then a lady's companion, until she was nothing more than a woman too well educated for hard labor and too poor to marry, yet far too proud to beg. Then, 3 months ago, A different letter arrived at the small house she had managed to secure after years of work. Modest, hard-won, the last stopping place after so much loss. It came from a London solicitor who, to her surprise, knew her reputation better than she imagined. A distant cousin of Joshua Colborne, dissolute notorious, had died, leaving behind an illegitimate daughter, Anne. No mother, no guardian, only the Colborne name, hanging over her like a shadow and a promise. The solicitor explained that Juliet's name had been recommended more than once by former servants in the region. For a family desperate to avoid scandal, discretion and reputation meant more than blood. So Juliet agreed. The money would help, she knew that, but it was not money that had made her step through the doorway that morning to take Anne into her arms. It was the frightened gaze of a 3-year-old, far too large for such a small face. And because somewhere deep in her heart, stubborn and aching, Juliet felt that caring for this child might be the last truly good thing she would ever do before fading entirely from the world that once had been hers. Now, as the steady sound of footsteps echoed down the narrow stone corridor, Juliet lifted her chin. He was coming, and she had to hold tight to a single, sharp truth. Joshua Colborne had ignored her for 12 years. There was no reason in the world for that to change now. Chapter 1. The Door That Opens. The door eased open, and the scrape of iron against old wood echoed through the room like a funeral bell. Juliet didn't turn at once. She remained where she was, standing beside the cradle, her hand still resting lightly on Anne's small shoulder. The child stirred, lashes trembling before settling again, as if sensing the world shifting around her. Juliet drew in a steady breath, cold air filling her lungs, and only then allowed her gaze to move toward the doorway. Joshua Colborne stood at the threshold, taller than she remembered, his broad shoulders filling the narrow frame of the door. He wore a black greatcoat, immaculate, and dark leather gloves still covered his hands. His black hair was slightly tousled by the wind, but his face, oh his face, was exactly as she had kept it in memory, severe, sharply cut, with deep brown eyes that assessed everything and revealed nothing. He did not smile, he did not greet her, he simply studied her, the way one examines a problem they never wished to solve. Juliet's stomach tightened, but her posture held steady. 12 years. 12 years since she had stood this close to him. 12 years since he had chosen another woman and left her alone in the center of a crowded ballroom, heart splintered, foolish enough to think she mattered. She would not lower her gaze now. Not for him. "Miss Weston," he said at last, his voice low, controlled, polished to its very edge. There was no surprise in it, no shadow of the past, only duty. "My lord," Juliet replied, and hated how steady her voice sounded, as if he no longer possessed the uncanny ability to unravel her from within. "The child is well, she eats, sleeps, and shows no signs of illness." His eyes shifted from her to the cradle. For a fleeting moment something changed in his expression, not softness but perhaps discomfort, perhaps guilt. He stepped into the room, boots heavy against the floorboards, and stopped beside Juliet. So close she could smell the leather, the faint woodsy note that dragged her, unwillingly, back to memories of ballroom nights and promises never spoken. Anne moved in her sleep, fingers curling in the air as though searching for something familiar. Joshua watched her with an intensity Juliet did not expect. He lifted a hand as if some old instinct, forgotten or unwelcome, rose before he could stop it, but he halted, gloved fingers suspended in the air, then slowly withdrew. "She looks like him," he murmured, more to himself than to her. "My cousin." "Yes," Juliet said softly, softer than she intended. "She has his eyes, and the way her brow furrows when she wakes." Joshua turned toward her, and this time his look was direct, cutting. "You knew him?" "No," she admitted. "I only heard of him, and saw the portrait the solicitor brought and asked me to keep for the child." He nodded, as though that settled something in his mind. The silence that followed was thick, weighted. Juliet folded her arms, not as defense but against the cold, though too late she realized how guarded the gesture must appear. Joshua made no comment. He simply continued watching the child, as if he needed to understand this before choosing any path forward. "The solicitor said you agreed to care for her without hesitation," he said finally. "Why?" The question caught her off guard. Juliet opened her mouth, closed it again, and then offered the piece of truth she could safely share. "Because many would take her in, but few would love her," she said, lowering her gaze to her hands. "And she deserved someone who cared, not someone fulfilling an obligation." Joshua looked at her for a long moment. Juliet had the strange impression that he saw something beyond the worn dress, beyond the tired posture, beyond the narrow life to which she had been reduced. But then he blinked, and the moment dissolved. He stepped back, reinstating the precise distance he believed appropriate. "You have done well," he said at last, his voice returning to the cool tone of a man concluding a task. "I've arranged proper accommodations for the child at Linfield Hall. We leave within the hour." Juliet kept silent. She expected nothing more. Joshua watched Anne, who shifted uneasily in her sleep, and for an instant his expression seemed unsettled. Not by the situation, but by his own uncertainty. "Given her age," he said quietly, "it is likely that you are the most familiar figure she has, the only one she recognizes as safe." The words, plain, factual, struck Juliet with an unexpected force. Not praise, simply truth, and for that very reason they mattered. She looked down, unsure of what to say. Joshua continued, more tense now, as though testing each syllable before releasing it. "Moving her to a new home without anyone she knows would be unwise. She may not adapt well." Silence. Juliet's pulse quickened, not with hope, but warning. She would not mistake this for an invitation. She would not grant him, nor herself, that power. He drew a breath, sounding like a man admitting something he'd rather not. "Therefore, I would like you to accompany the child until she adjusts to her new surroundings. It is the most reasonable course." Juliet did not answer at once. She clasped her hands in her apron, holding them as though to stop them from saying no, before her mind had time to think. She wanted to refuse. She wanted to say she had her own life, however fragile, her own griefs, her own small ruins to tend. She wanted to say she could not remain close to him again, to the man she had taught herself to forget in order to survive. But Anne needed her. And everything in that little girl's gaze said no one else in the world felt familiar. No one else could be a haven, at least for now. Juliet lifted her eyes, steadying her voice. "If you believe this is what's best for Anne," she said with a calm she did not feel, "then I will do what is necessary." It was not submission, not quick acceptance, not eagerness. It was duty, it was protection. It was the last thing her dignity still allowed her to give. Joshua nodded, briefly, almost relieved, and left the room, closing the door with a quietness that contrasted sharply with the chaos he left in his wake. When his footsteps faded down the corridor, Juliet moved to the cradle, knelt beside it, and brushed her fingers through Anne's golden curls. "We'll go with him, my darling," she whispered, almost a sigh, "only until you're safe. After that, we'll see." She tried to believe it, tried with every bit of strength she had left, but the small spark in her chest, stubborn, uninvited, impossible to silence, refused to die. Chapter 2. The Weight of Silence. Joshua descended the stone steps with measured strides, though his chest felt painfully tight, as if something unseen were pressing hard against him. He had not expected this. He had not expected her. When the solicitor mentioned the name, Miss Juliet Weston, Joshua had convinced himself it must be coincidence. It would be far too absurd if the child's caretaker happened to be the same young woman with whom he had danced twice so many years ago, in a London ballroom that now seemed to belong to another lifetime. But it wasn't coincidence. It was her. The same blue eyes, now deeper, carrying a sorrow that had not existed when she was 16. The same dark chestnut hair, simply pinned. The same straight, composed posture, even wrapped in a dress so worn that any maid at Linfield would have discarded it without thought. She had aged, as everyone does, but there was a dignity in her he had never imagined. And something more, something that unsettled him intensely, though he lacked the courage to name it. Joshua paused beside the carriage, rested a hand against the polished wood, and shut his eyes for a moment. The cold wind grazed his skin, but he barely felt it. What he did feel was memory, her smile as they danced, her hand in his, light, shy, full of youthful hope, the one moment he had let desire brush against duty before stepping back. His father had been clear. The alliance with the Devereux family was essential. Juliet Weston was the daughter of a penniless baron. One dance was acceptable, two, reckless. Anything more, disastrous. Joshua had done what was expected of him. He married Catherine. And when she died in childbirth, taking with her the child he never met, only a hollow quiet remained, as if he had followed every rule and still failed at something essential. "My lord." The coachman's voice broke through his thoughts. "Everything's ready. We can leave whenever you wish." Joshua opened his eyes. "Wait a little longer. Miss Weston is preparing the child." The coachman nodded and stepped aside. Joshua lingered, letting his thoughts drift back to the small room he had just left. Juliet had spoken little, less than he expected, but every word had been measured, steady as if she were building a wall between herself and the world. And yet, when she looked at Anne, there had been tenderness, deep, instinctive tenderness, not the polite sweetness trained into society ladies, something else entirely. Love without audience. Love that existed simply because it was needed. And then there was the almost painful way Juliet reacted when he told her he would take the child. She did not plead. She did not ask for anything. She simply stood there, stiff, trying, failing to hide her hurt. Not because she was losing a position, but because she was being separated from the little girl. And when he asked her to accompany Anne for a time, she had not accepted at once. He had seen her resistance, her intact dignity, the clear instinct to say no, and yet she agreed, for the child's sake. A fissure opened in him then, widening with every breath. He had imagined adopting the child, hiring a suitable nurse, putting everything in order, and moving on with the neat efficiency expected of a viscount. But he had not imagined this, that Juliet Weston would care, truly care for an orphaned child, a girl with no one but a distant cousin to claim her. And that moved him, because when he looked at Anne, so small, so alone, he saw a trace of himself. He saw the boy who lost his mother at 3, the emptiness no one tried to fill, the loneliness that eventually became routine, and he understood that tearing Anne away from Juliet now would be cruel. Joshua knew all too well the cold shock of waking in an unfamiliar house without a familiar face in sight. He knew it far too well. So when he told Juliet she would travel with them, it wasn't impulse, it wasn't kindness, it wasn't indulgence. It was memory. It was old guilt. It was the quiet refusal to let another child suffer the way he once had. He glanced toward the modest house, small for the name Weston, but remarkably neat and orderly despite hardship. A place no baron's daughter should have ended in, and yet Juliet stood unbowed, dignified, untouched by bitterness, triumphant despite ruin. Something warm and unwelcome tightened in his chest. Not pity. Pity would have insulted her. Something closer to remorse. Because for 12 years he had avoided thinking of her. It had taken discipline. To think of Juliet Weston was to imagine everything that might have been, and Joshua could not allow himself that indulgence. "She deserved more," he whispered, so quietly that the wind almost stole the words. "She deserved someone who chose her, and I spent 12 years pretending I didn't know that." Just then the house door opened. Juliet stepped out carrying Anne in her arms. The child, half asleep, blinked once, whimpered, and clutched the fabric of Juliet's dress before resting her head on her shoulder again. Juliet did not look at him. She descended the steps carefully, holding the child with a fierce, protective strength. Joshua moved toward her. "Allow me." She hesitated, only for a second, but long enough to stretch time, then nodded. He took the small trunk. Their fingers brushed, brief, accidental, and both drew back as if the touch had burned. The coachman secured the trunk. When Joshua returned, Juliet was already stepping inside with Anne in her arms. He offered his hand. Juliet looked first at the glove, then at his face. For an instant, he was certain she would refuse, but she placed her free hand in his, only as much as courtesy demanded, and entered with the quiet grace of someone who learned long ago to hide every fragility. Joshua followed. The door shut. The carriage lurched into motion. Inside, silence settled heavily. Anne shifted, seeking Juliet instinctively, her fist curling into the fabric of her dress. Joshua watched the gesture, small, devastating, and swallowed hard. Juliet stared out the window, her profile washed in pale morning light. Joshua couldn't look away. 12 years without seeing her. And now she sat there, so close, so unreachable, and he had no idea what to say. "How long will the journey take?" she asked, still watching the road. 2 hours. Perhaps less if the roads remain clear. She nodded. Joshua sat in the velvet-lined seat, surrounded by the comfort he had always known, and felt poorer than he ever had. Because he had everything, and she, who should have had everything, had nothing. And the fault, he knew, was not the world's alone. It was his. Chapter 3. The House of Ghosts. The estate rose on the horizon like an apparition pulled from an old dream, or a nightmare. Juliet couldn't yet tell which. Linfield Hall stood in pale stone, 3 floors of tall symmetrical windows, framed by gardens that remained impeccably ordered even in winter. The iron gates opened with quiet ease, and 2 footmen bowed discreetly as the carriage passed through. Juliet's stomach tightened. This was his world, the world that had always been his, and she was here only because a 3-year-old needed a familiar face. Anne had woken during the journey, frightened, reaching for Juliet with small hiccuping sobs. Juliet soothed her with soft songs and gentle touches. Joshua said nothing. He only watched, quietly, intently, in a way Juliet couldn't decipher. Not disapproval, not detachment. Something between curiosity and unease, as if he were trying to understand an emotional language he had never learned. The carriage halted before the grand entrance. A white-haired butler stood at the top of the steps, posture immaculate. 2 maids waited behind him, still as statues. Joshua stepped out first. Juliet hesitated. Then she accepted the hand he offered her. The touch was formal, brief, yet she still felt the warmth through the glove before withdrawing her hand carefully. "Welcome home, my lord," the butler said with a slight bow. His gaze flicked over Juliet and Anne, only the faintest breath of attention, too controlled to read. "The house has been prepared according to your instructions. Thank you, Whitley." Joshua nodded just enough to acknowledge him. Then he made a nearly imperceptible gesture toward Juliet. "This is Miss Weston. She will look after the child during the transition. Choose a suitable room for her near the nursery." Whitley offered a restrained bow, the only hint of surprise. No raised brows, no exchanged glances, only the subtle pause of a man holding a breath before continuing. "As you wish, my lord." "And inform the staff of what is due," Joshua added, his voice firm, precise. "She is Edward Colborne's daughter. She will remain under my protection. Both the child and Miss Weston are to be treated with proper respect." The servants didn't visibly react, but Juliet sensed the shift, a stiffening of air, a careful, measured quiet. She knew what they were thinking. Whispers about the dissolute cousin, about scandal, about illegitimacy, about a child like Anne stepping into this house as though she had any right to it. Juliet held Anne tighter. The girl had begun to whimper again, her face burrowing into Juliet's shoulder. "It's all right, sweetheart," she whispered. "We're safe." Joshua watched them for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then he motioned for them to follow. Inside the foyer, Juliet lost her breath for a second. Light marble, almost gleaming, a vast crystal chandelier. Walls covered with portraits of ancestors, cold aristocratic eyes looking down as if judging in silence. She felt small, unwelcome, as though the ruin of the Weston name clung visibly to her. Joshua climbed the stairs without looking back, and Juliet followed, holding Anne firmly, careful not to trip over her own skirts. The second-floor corridor stretched long and stately, lined with dark blue carpets. Joshua stopped at a door, opened it, and stepped aside for her to enter. The nursery was spacious and carefully prepared, a pale canopy, a wooden toy chest, a small writing desk, a new cradle still smelling of polished wood, everything perfect, everything strange. Anne began to cry, first softly, then with sharp panic, her face scrunching with fear. Juliet sat on the bed, rocking her gently, whispering soothing words. Joshua stood at the doorway. Juliet felt his gaze, heavy, searching, impossible to interpret. "She isn't used to this," she said quietly without looking up. "She needs time. She'll have whatever time she needs." His voice carried something difficult to name, not irritation, almost hesitation. "Thank you, my lord." Silence. Then slow footsteps. Joshua stepped closer but kept a respectful distance, close enough to see Anne's trembling face, far enough not to intrude. His eyes rested on the fragile body curled against Juliet, and something shifted in his expression. Something vulnerable, quick but real. "I'm sorry," he murmured. "I've never done this. I've never been responsible for a child, so I don't know how to care for one." Juliet lifted her gaze. For an instant, she saw the young man who once danced with her, not the cold Viscount, not the rigid lord, but someone afraid of failing at simple, essential things. "Then learn," she said softly, yet with steady strength. "She doesn't need perfection, only someone who stays. Someone who loves her." His eyes found hers, just a second, but enough for the air to thicken between them. Then the mask returned. "Your room is next door," he said, stepping back. "If you need anything, ask Whitley." "Thank you, my lord." He hesitated, just half a breath, as though something remained caught behind his teeth, but he only nodded and left. The door closed with a quiet click. Juliet exhaled. Anne had already begun exploring the room, still clutching the hem of her dress. Juliet lay beside the little girl, gazing up at the ornate ceiling. The house was beautiful, rich, precise, and Juliet could feel that precision in the cold walls, the subdued servants, the way Joshua walked, like a man who had lost much and welcomed little. "He's grieving someone," she whispered to Anne, who was now playing with the ribbon of her dress, "and I think he doesn't know how to find anything back." Anne grabbed her hand. Juliet felt the small, firm squeeze, a quiet plea. And for the first time since leaving her humble home, Juliet felt something other than fear. She felt purpose. Perhaps, just perhaps, she could help Anne find her place here. Perhaps she could even help Joshua without promises, without illusions. Simply by showing him, step by careful step, the path he never learned to walk. Even if it meant beginning to dismantle, brick by brick, the walls she had built around her own heart. Chapter 4. The Invisible Shield. Joshua went down to the study before dawn, unable to sleep. The house lay silent, wrapped in the darkness that comes just before first light. He lit only a single candle in the silver candelabrum and sat at the mahogany desk. Papers were piled before him, letters from stewards, estate reports, invitations he would never answer, but none of them held his attention. His thoughts remained 2 floors above, where Juliet Weston slept in the room next to the nursery, and where Anne, for the first time in her brief life, lay under the Colborne roof. He pressed his forehead into his hands, feeling the weight of a night without rest. "I have never done this." The words he'd spoken to Juliet echoed in his mind like an unwelcome confession. He had not meant to show weakness. Had not meant to admit that, faced with a 3-year-old child, he felt more lost than in any political negotiation or inheritance dispute. But she had looked at him with those blue eyes, not with pity, but with something worse. Understanding. As if she could see straight through the armor he had worn for so long he'd forgotten how to live without it. And then she had said, "Then learn." Simple, direct. As if learning how to love were nothing more than a matter of choice, and not the most dangerous territory Joshua knew. He had learned to manage estates, to negotiate contracts, to keep his composure in the face of scandal and loss. But love. Love demanded a vulnerability he had buried with Catherine 4 years earlier, when he finally understood he had been a proper husband, but never a true one. The study door opened with a soft creak. Joshua lifted his head, expecting Whitley. But it was her. Juliet, in a robe over a plain nightgown, a wool shawl thrown around her shoulders, and her dark hair loose falling down her back to her waist. She was barefoot. He noticed by the hem of her clothes and by the faint chill that seemed to follow her from the floor, and for a moment the sight jarred him. If any servant saw her like this at this hour, alone in the Viscount's study, the house would have something to whisper about for weeks. She stopped at the threshold, eyes widening when she realized he was not alone. Instinctively, she pulled the shawl tighter around herself, as if she could hide her hair and bare feet at once. "Forgive me, my lord," she said, her voice rough with sleep. "I didn't know you were here. Anne asked for water and I took off my boots so as not to wake her again. I thought to fetch it from the kitchen without disturbing the servants. But I've mistaken the corridor." Joshua rose at once, habit stronger than exhaustion. The awareness of how improper this scene was scratched at the surface of his discipline, but he didn't step back. "There's no need to apologize," he answered. "This house is large. It's easy to lose your way in it, in every sense." He hesitated, then added, "There's a water jug there on the sideboard. Take it." Juliet nodded and crossed the room, her steps silent on the rug. Joshua watched her pour water into a crystal glass, her movements precise and restrained, as though each gesture were calculated not to occupy more space than strictly necessary. She lived like that, he realized, small, invisible. As if she had learned that existing quietly was safer than being seen. For a brief moment he wondered, with a sharp discomfort he didn't care to examine, what people would say if someone walked in and saw her here, hair loose, feet bare, alone with him. The thought alone was enough to make him shift slightly away from the desk, as if trying to restore some of the distance that propriety demanded. "Is Anne well?" he asked, more to break the silence than out of need for reassurance. "Yes," Juliet replied, not quite meeting his gaze. "She woke frightened but went back to sleep when she realized I was still there. I'll take her the water for when she wakes again." She held the glass with both hands, as though the crystal might slip from her fingers. "It's all very different," she added softly. "She needs time to feel safe. And you?" The question left him before he could stop it. "Do you feel safe here?" Juliet finally lifted her eyes to his, and Joshua saw surprise there. Not the gentle surprise of unexpected kindness, but the wary surprise of someone who does not trust questions asked in the dark. "Why do you ask, my lord?" "Because this house is strange to you," Joshua said, choosing his words with care. "Because you are here by necessity, not choice, and because I—" He stopped, feeling the edge of what he could say collide with what he could not yet admit. "Because I want Anne to feel at home, and she won't if you don't." It was true, but not the whole truth. The whole truth was that Joshua could not stop thinking about the way Juliet held Anne, with a tenderness he had never seen in his own mother, nor in hired nurses, nor even in Catherine, who died before she could hold the child she carried. Juliet loved that little girl, no shared blood, no legal bond, nothing but the pure, inexplicable decision to care for someone nobody else wanted. And that unsettled Joshua more than he liked to acknowledge. "I feel," Juliet began, then faltered. She looked toward the window, where the first hint of dawn was turning the sky a deep cold blue. "I feel as I have always felt, my lord, as if I were passing through." Her answer cut deeper than he expected. He knew that feeling. He knew what it was to live in grand, wealthy houses, surrounded by everything, and still sensed that nothing there truly belonged to him. His mother had died when he was 3. His father, distant and austere, died when Joshua was 25, leaving him the title, the estates, and no instruction at all on how to fill the hollow that came from a life without affection. "You should not feel that way," Joshua said, his voice lower than he intended. Not here. Juliet held his gaze for a long moment, and he saw something shift in her eyes, not softness, not gratitude. Something closer to an understanding she hadn't asked for, as if she were seeing some part of him he showed to no one. "And do you, my lord?" she asked, gentle but unflinching. "Do you feel at home here?" The question caught him completely unarmed. No one had ever asked him that. No one questioned whether a viscount in his own house felt at home. It was assumed, expected, and entirely untrue. "No," Joshua admitted after a short, heavy silence. The word left him like a confession torn out by force, not for a long time. The moment he said it, he realized he had gone too far, too quickly, for someone who had spent his life measuring each phrase. But he didn't retract it. Juliet nodded slowly, as though that answer fit into something she had already guessed. She set the glass back on the sideboard and pulled the shawl more tightly around her shoulders, reclaiming the boundaries of herself. "Then perhaps," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "we might learn together." She didn't smile. There was no lightness in her words, only a painful kind of realism. You to care, I to feel less temporary, and Anne to have a real home. Something clenched in his chest. Not discomfort, something far more dangerous. Hope. And hope, he had learned long ago, was the most treacherous feeling of all. "Perhaps," he said. It was all he could offer. Juliet dipped her head, not a curtsy, just a quiet farewell, and turned to go. She paused in the doorway, one hand on the frame, the shawl falling almost to her bare ankles. "Thank you, my lord," she said, without quite looking at him, "for asking me to stay. I know it was not exactly your intention, but I know you were thinking of Anne." Joshua held her gaze when she finally met his eyes. "It wasn't my first choice," he said, because a full lie felt unbearable. "But perhaps it should have been." She didn't answer. She simply left, closing the door behind her with a soft click, and Joshua was alone again in the study, surrounded by papers that no longer mattered, and by a dawn he wasn't sure he deserved to witness. He returned to the desk, but didn't touch the documents. Instead, he opened the side drawer and drew out an old letter, tucked between pages of account books. Hers, or rather, about her. A letter the solicitor had sent months earlier, mentioning that Miss Juliet Weston, of good reputation but reduced means, had agreed to care for the child. Joshua had read the name, and deep down known at once who it was. Juliet Weston was not just any name to him, had never been. He had spent the following days telling himself it might be another woman, another fallen gentlewoman with the same name, because it was easier to believe in coincidence than to admit the past was knocking at his door again. It had not been coincidence. It never was. It was fate or punishment or perhaps both. He could have chosen any other solution. He could have had Anne brought at once, hired a nurse in London, settled the matter with impeccable efficiency, and kept Juliet at a safe distance, reduced to a footnote in some formal report. But he hadn't. Unsure what to do with the child in his care, he had allowed the arrangement to stand, allowed the solicitor to turn to her, because some part of him, small, stubborn, embarrassingly human, had wanted to see her again, wanted to know if she remembered, wanted to know if he had ruined only his own life, or hers as well. Now he knew, and the answer was worse than he'd feared. He had broken her. Not with deliberate cruelty, but with the passive cruelty of disappearing, of leaving her with no explanation, no farewell, nothing but the slow, corroding silence that wounds as surely as any insult. And now she was here, in his house, caring for a child he ought to love, but did not yet know how. And Joshua realized, with a clarity that frightened him, that he would not easily let her go this time. Not because he loved her, not yet, perhaps never, but because she was the only person who looked at him and saw not the Viscount, not the title, not the estate. She saw the man he hid, the man who did not know how to care, the man living as a stranger in his own life, and somehow, in a way he did not understand, that made him want to be better, even if he had no idea where to begin. Chapter 5. Fragments of Light. Juliet woke to find the sun already high, surprised she had slept so long. Anne was sitting on the rug beside the bed, playing with a porcelain doll someone, probably a maid, had left there during the night. The little girl hummed under her breath, but when she noticed Juliet was awake, she fell silent at once, as if she needed to make sure it was safe to smile before daring it. Only then did the soft melody return, tentative and quiet. Juliet's chest tightened with tenderness. It was these small moments, invisible to the world, that reminded her there was still some light left in her life. She rose slowly, pinned her hair into a simple bun, and slipped into a brown wool dress. She did not have many choices. Her luggage was modest, and the only thing of value she had brought with her was a small silver locket that had belonged to her mother. Juliet touched the cool metal, drew in a breath, then knelt beside the child. "Good morning, my love," she said. "Did you sleep well?" Anne nodded but didn't smile. Her light eyes, far too serious for 3 years old, looked for Juliet's hand first. Only after finding it did she turn back to the doll. Juliet knew that look, the caution of someone who had learned far too early that the world changed quickly and not always kindly. "Shall we have breakfast?" Juliet suggested, holding out her hand. Anne took it at once, her small fingers warm and clinging with almost desperate strength. The corridor was quiet, lit only by the thin, cold light of morning. A maid led them to the breakfast room, large, imposing, with a table that could seat 20, though only one place had been laid at the head. Joshua was not there. "My lord has already taken breakfast, miss," said the young maid with the red hair. "He asked me to say he'll be in the stables if you should need him." Juliet nodded, ignoring the odd little sting of disappointment that made no sense at all. She had not expected him to be there. She expected nothing from him, in truth. And yet his absence pressed at her. "Could you bring something for the child?" she asked. "Bread, eggs, warm milk, if there is any." The maid hesitated, as though weighing whether Anne deserved that sort of care, but then nodded and left. Juliet settled the girl on a makeshift high chair. Anne gripped the table edge with both hands, shoulders tense, as if waiting for permission to relax. Juliet brushed a loose strand of hair behind her ear. Breakfast arrived on silver trays. Juliet ate little, focusing instead on encouraging Anne, who chewed with exaggerated care, as if still trying to decide whether there would be enough food that she did not need to hurry. After the meal, Juliet decided to explore the grounds. She dressed Anne in a small coat she had found in the nursery's chest and led her down the stone steps into the gardens. The air was cold and smelled of damp earth. Linfield Hall seemed even larger in the pale daylight. Symmetrical flower beds, ancient oaks, gravel paths leading to statues and silent fountains. In the distance, she spotted the stables. And she saw Joshua. He stood beside a tall black horse, speaking with the stable master. There was something different about him there, away from marble floors and ancestral portraits, something more alive. Juliet hesitated. She wasn't sure if she should go closer. Anne's eyes widened at the sight of the animal, caught somewhere between fascination and fear, and before Juliet could catch her, she bolted towards the horse. "Anne!" Juliet's voice cracked. "Anne, wait!" The horse stepped back, uneasy, snorting. Juliet's stomach dropped, her heart misfired, painful and sharp. For a moment her body simply refused to move. Joshua turned at once. His eyes widened and he reacted before Juliet could draw breath. He handed the reins to the groom, ran forward and scooped the child into his arms just as she reached the animal. Anne laughed, thinking it a game, but Joshua held her firmly, his arm a solid shield around her small body. "She can't run up to him like that," he said, voice steady but not harsh. "The horse might startle." Juliet reached them, breathless, her knees unsteady. "I know, I'm sorry, she slipped away from me, "It's all right," Joshua murmured, softer now. He did not hand Anne back straight away. Instead, he turned towards the horse and stepped closer with care. "Slowly, like this, see? He's gentle if you are gentle too." Anne touched the horse's muzzle with small, cautious fingers. The animal dipped its head. Juliet let out a shaky breath, only then realizing she'd been holding it. "She likes animals," Juliet said, still trying to steady herself. "There was a cat where we lived. She followed him all over the house." Joshua nodded, his gaze drifting for a moment to some distant memory. "I had a dog as a boy," he said. "My father gave it away when I was 7, said it wasn't appropriate for a future Viscount to grow too attached to animals." Something cracked quietly inside Juliet. "That is cruel," she said, before she could soften the words. Joshua looked as if he had not heard it called that in a long time. "Yes," he answered quietly. "It was." A heavy silence settled between them. Anne, calmer now, rested her head on his shoulder while stroking the horse's mane. The cold wind cut across the gardens. Something inside Juliet, something long buried, shifted. "My mother died when I was young," she said, offering no details. "My father never recovered. After that I had to learn to care. It was the only thing that made sense." Joshua took a few seconds before replying. "My mother died when I was 6, he murmured. "My father never spoke of her again. The same wound, different ages, same hollow space." Juliet swallowed. "That's why you don't know how to care," she said quietly. "No one ever showed you you were allowed to." Joshua lifted his eyes to hers. For a moment something in him yielded, softly but deeply. "And you?" he asked. "Why do you know how?" Juliet squeezed Anne's hand. "Because I had to learn early," she answered. "Because when everything was taken from me, caring for someone was the only thing that made me feel I still mattered." Joshua seemed to stop breathing. Then he bent his head slightly toward the child, as if drawing courage from her weight in his arms. "But you do matter," he said, so low Juliet almost didn't hear. A pause, a heartbeat of deliberate silence. "Even if no one has ever told you so." Juliet stopped walking. Air seemed to vanish from her lungs. She couldn't speak. She could only look at him, stunned by how those words could cut so deep and still feel like kindness. "Thank you," she whispered at last when her voice returned. Joshua only inclined his head and turned his attention back to Anne, who was now stroking the horse's mane with growing confidence. Juliet stood there, feeling the cold on her cheeks and a new restless warmth unfurling in her chest, because for the first time in 12 years she felt that perhaps, just perhaps, she wasn't entirely alone. And that possibility frightened her more than any solitude she had ever known. Chapter 6. The Fear of Falling. Joshua shut himself in the study for the rest of the day, pretending there was urgent work that could not wait. There was, of course, there always was, but that wasn't what kept him away. It was fear. A visceral, unreasonable fear he hadn't felt since he was 6 years old and woke one morning to discover his mother would never come back. He had told Juliet that she mattered. He had said it out loud without thinking, and now the words haunted him like stubborn ghosts. It had not been a lie. That was the problem. It was the truth. And truths like that were dangerous. They opened doors he had spent 12 years barring shut. They exposed vulnerabilities a Viscount was not permitted to have. The sun began to set, washing the sky in amber and orange through the tall study windows. Joshua heard footsteps in the corridor, light, measured, and knew it was her. Juliet. On her way to the nursery, most likely, to put Anne to bed. He pictured it, the child in her arms, fair hair against the worn navy dress, Juliet's soft voice singing a lullaby. Something no one had ever sung for him. Something inside him twisted. It wasn't jealousy. It was envy. Envy of Anne for having someone who loved her without condition. Envy of Juliet for knowing how to love without flinching at the risk of being abandoned again. And envy of them both for having something he had never truly known. Belonging. The study door opened without warning. Joshua looked up, irritation rising at the intrusion. But it died the moment he saw Whitley standing in the doorway, expression grave. "My lord, forgive the interruption," the butler said, as formal as ever. "But you have a visitor. Viscount Hartwell has arrived unannounced." Joshua felt his stomach drop. Hartwell. One of his father's old friends, now an unofficial advisor to the Colborne family. A man who believed titles carried social obligations that could never be ignored. and who would certainly have opinions about a single woman and a bastard child under Joshua's roof. "Tell him I am indisposed," Joshua began, but Whitley shook his head. "He is already in the drawing room, my lord. He came from the neighboring estate and said he had some days ago received rumors that demanded your immediate attention." Rumors from days ago. Not something born that morning, but something already making its rounds. Letters exchanged between stewards, servants talking in market squares, curious glances from watchful neighbors. It took only a spark for a scandal to begin. Joshua closed his eyes for a moment and drew a slow breath. There was no choice. Refusing to see Hartwell would be a direct insult, and insulting a man with such connections would be unwise. "Very well. Tell him I'll be there shortly." Whitley bowed and left. Joshua rose, straightened his waistcoat and braced himself for the battle he knew was coming. But before he stepped out, he glanced upward, toward the second floor where Juliet and Anne were, and something clenched hard inside him. Protection. An old, primitive instinct that told him to stand between them and any threat, even if the threat was made only of words. Viscount Hartwell was a man in his early 60s, white hair slicked back, pale sharp eyes that missed nothing. He stood near the fireplace, hands clasped behind his back, when Joshua entered the drawing room. "Hartwell," Joshua greeted, keeping his tone neutral. "A surprise." "Joshua," the older man replied, "forgive my lack of warning, but certain rumors reached me. As I was already in the area on estate business, I thought it best to come in person." "Rumors?" Joshua folded his arms, straight as a blade. "What sort of rumors?" Hartwell drew a measured breath, weighing each word. "That you have brought a child to Linfield Hall, Edward Colborne's daughter, by a woman of lower station who died after giving birth, and that you have engaged a lady of uncertain reputation to care for her." Joshua's blood burned, but his face remained perfectly composed. "Uncertain reputation," he said, voice like ice. "Miss Weston is a woman of impeccable character, a baron's daughter, well-educated, discreet. She has cared for Anne for months and asked for nothing but the bare minimum in return. If anyone here has a questionable reputation, it was my cousin Edward who abandoned his own child." The silence that followed wasn't hostile, it was startled. "I understand your defense, Joshua," Hartwell said slowly, "but you must consider appearances." "A single woman under your roof without a chaperone." "She is here because of Anne," Joshua cut in, cold and precise, "and she will remain as long as necessary. Anyone who wishes to discuss it, discusses it with me." Hartwell studied him for a long moment. Then he dipped his head slightly. "You care about her?" Joshua did not answer. The truth, so new, so fragile, felt far too dangerous to lay bare in front of any man. Anyone, but perhaps the woman herself. Hartwell sighed. "Your father would not approve. Duty above all, that was his creed." The old pressure rose in Joshua's chest again, the same weight that had crushed his childhood. "I know. And look where it led him," Joshua replied. "He died alone, surrounded by land and property, with no one who truly mourned him." Hartwell said nothing. He didn't need to. He simply picked up his hat, walked to the door, and before leaving added, "Be careful, Joshua." When a man allows his heart to interfere, the rest begins to crumble. He left, and Joshua remained, shaking with anger, and with something far more dangerous. He took the stairs without thinking, two at a time. He didn't know exactly what he was seeking, peace perhaps, or simply proof that Juliet and Anne were safe. The nursery door was slightly ajar. He heard her voice, singing softly, a simple, old melody. Or perhaps it was just his memory trying to give shape to something he had never truly had. Joshua pushed the door open. Juliet sat in the rocking chair, Anne asleep in her arms. She lifted her gaze when she saw him, surprised, but kept the gentle rhythm still cradling the child. A little earlier, she had heard voices in the corridor, a man's voice, firm and edged with disdain. She hadn't recognized it, but she recognized the effect now in Joshua's tense jaw. Someone had judged him, and he carried that weight on his shoulders. "She had trouble falling asleep," Juliet whispered. "She asked about the horse." Said she wants to see him again tomorrow. Joshua only nodded. The room was warm, alive, so unlike what it had always been, and not because of the furniture, but because of the way Juliet held Anne, as though the entire world fit in the curve of her arms. That was what struck him, the blow that stole his breath, the sight that explained everything he didn't yet know how to say, everything he had once wanted and lost before he could even reach for it. Juliet noticed the shadow on his face. "You don't have to defend me to whoever that was," she said softly. "I know what people think. I know the kind of discomfort my presence can cause." "I don't care what they say," Joshua answered, startling himself with how true it sounded. "You are here because Anne needs you." And as he spoke, he realized it was more than that. "And because I—" The sentence died. To complete it would be to betray more than he could bear to reveal. Joshua crossed the room slowly. That old drilled-in voice of propriety whispered at him, a man and a woman alone in a nursery. He ignored it, but only until halfway across. He stopped there, respectful, like someone afraid of desecrating something sacred. Juliet raised her eyes. "Because you—" she prompted. He swallowed. How could he explain that this scene, this tired woman, this sleeping child tucked against her heart, touched the exact place where he kept what remained of his grief? "Because I don't want—" He drew a breath. "I don't want the house to go back to being empty so soon." Juliet blinked, slowly. There was no surprise in her face, only the clear understanding that this wasn't about her. It was about what the sight of her and Anne awoke in him. Joshua tried again. "You brought—" He hesitated, searching for a word that wouldn't betray him. "Movement to this house. Life. That is all." His gaze drifted around the room, the fire glowing in the grate, a toy forgotten at the foot of the chair, Juliet's shawl in the corner. Small things, trivial things. And yet they broke the harsh silence of this place, the same silence that had followed him since the day he lost everything that might have been. Juliet adjusted Anne's head against her shoulder. The gesture was so natural that Joshua's throat tightened. "Houses that are too empty echo," she said softly. "Sometimes they confuse what we hear. Simple, neutral, painfully true." Joshua let out a weary breath. "Perhaps that's it," he replied, his voice lower than he intended. "Perhaps the echo has changed." Juliet said nothing. She did not move closer, did not pull away. She only kept rocking Anne as though that small body were the center of the world. And it was. That was exactly what disarmed him. Because that image, a woman in his house cradling a child, was something he had believed lost before he ever had it. Something his wife had never been able to give him. Something he had taught himself to bury without looking at it. Something he had convinced himself he no longer had the right to want. And suddenly here it was, without announcement, without pretense, without asking permission of old pain. He took a step forward, almost without noticing. Not out of desire, but out of recognition, and also out of mourning. "I didn't imagine—" His voice was barely a thread. "I didn't imagine seeing this would hit me so hard." Juliet glanced up, a quiet hint of surprise in her eyes, but she didn't ask what exactly had struck him. She wasn't intimate enough to ask, and she was far too proud to pretend such intimacy. Joshua moved a little closer, slowly, asking for permission with every inch. He raised a hand, stopped halfway. She did not pull back, but she didn't lean into him either. The touch happened like a deliberate accident, the tips of his fingers brushing a strand of Anne's fair hair. Nothing more. But it was enough to change the weight of the silence between them. For 2 seconds, perhaps 3, he allowed himself to exist inside that scene he had always imagined and never possessed. Then Anne sighed, soft, absent, and reality slid back between them. Joshua stepped away. Not too quickly, just enough to reclaim the control that kept slipping through old cracks. He left the room before he crossed a line he didn't yet know how to name. Out in the corridor, he rested his back against the closed door, shut his eyes. drew a deep breath as if his chest were learning how to expand again. What was happening to him? Something that hurt and comforted at once. Because for the first time in many years, everything he had lost and everything he had once dared to wish for stood before him, if only for a moment, in the quiet shape of a promise that had not yet spoken its name. Chapter 7. The Impossible Choice. Juliet did not sleep well in the nights that followed, not from torment, but from something she could not yet name. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the scene again. The warm nursery, the fire glowing softly, Anne heavy and warm in her arms, and Joshua Colborne standing in the doorway as if he'd stumbled into a dream he had never dared to want. He had taken only a few steps into the room, nothing improper, nothing a lady could not recount without blushing, and yet there was something in that moment she had no language for. The way he had looked at the sleeping child, the way he had looked at her. The hesitation in his hand as he reached out, the brief touch on the girl's blonde curls, as though some invisible thread tied him to that small head resting against Juliet's chest. It wasn't the first time Juliet had lost sleep because of him. At 16, she had lain awake for weeks over 2 dances and 1 compliment about her eyes. It had been foolish and girlish, but it had been real. The feeling of being seen, of being chosen even for a brief instant in a ballroom where she had always felt like part of the wallpaper. Now the unrest was different. There were no candle-lit chandeliers, no orchestra, no laughter behind lace fans. There was an orphaned child, a tired man, and a house far too large for the silence it held. And Juliet was there not as a debutante, but as a woman who had learned to outlive losses a 16-year-old girl could never have imagined bearing. She turned onto her side and pulled the blanket up to her chin. Something inside her, something old, the exact age of 12 years, was starting to wake up, and that, more than anything, terrified her. The days that followed settled into a routine that at first seemed safe. In the mornings, Juliet helped Anne dress, gently combed through her fair curls, and taught her little songs her own mother had once sung back when there was still music in Weston Hall. Then they went down to breakfast. Sometimes Joshua was already at the table. Other times, only an empty cup and a folded newspaper betrayed that he had come and gone too early for their paths to cross. Juliet did not seek him out. Not on purpose. Even so, she began to notice small traces of his presence everywhere. A coat left over the back of a chair by the fireplace, a walking stick resting by the study door, a leather folio abandoned on the sideboard in the hall. It was as if Linfield Hall, so long just a grand, impeccably ordered house under Whitley's efficient command, had begun, little by little, to reveal the man who lived in it. One morning, 2 weeks after her arrival, Anne woke talking about the horse again. "The brown one?" she insisted, eyes already shining. "The one with the wise face." Juliet laughed, despite the ache in her chest. Children had a particular gift for naming things with a precision adults rarely allowed themselves. "If the weather holds, and my lord agrees, we may go," she relented. The day was cold but dry. A pale sun pressed through the clouds, softening the severity of Linfield's fields. Juliet wrapped Anne in a heavy coat and, after breakfast, led her out to the stables. Joshua was there. This time he did not pretend to be distracted. When he heard their steps rustling in the straw, he turned to them fully. His gaze went to the child first, a habit he had learned almost against his will, and only then to Juliet. "She wants to see the horse again," Juliet explained, keeping her tone neutral. "If it's no trouble." "It is no trouble," he answered, a little too quickly. Anne ran to the stall where the horse was lazily chewing. Joshua followed, taut for an instant, then more at ease when he saw the animal accept the child's small hand patiently. "Can I ride?" Anne asked, turning to him with a confidence she hadn't had on the first day. Joshua looked at Juliet, not as a man going through the motions of courtesy, but with genuine search for her approval. "If Miss Weston agrees," he said. Juliet held his gaze. He was a man who carried a great many guilts. She had already seen that. But he was not careless. "I trust you, my lord," she answered simply, and as she said it she realized it was true. He settled Anne on the back of a gentle horse, and led it around the paddock in slow circles. The child's laughter cut through the cold air like a late summer sunbeam. Juliet stood at the wooden fence, fingers gripping the rough surface, the wind tugging stray strands from her bun. That image tasted almost cruelly like possibility. A man, a child, a woman watching from the edge. Three figures that to any passing stranger might have looked like a family. Juliet's chest tightened, not because it was true, but precisely because it wasn't. She knew her place. She knew where the border lay, and how much it hurt to stand too close to it. When Anne climbed down, cheeks flushed and eyes bright, she ran straight into Juliet's arms. "Aunt Juliet, I flew!" she gasped. "The horse took me so high." Juliet laughed and hugged her tightly. "I saw, my love." Joshua was watching. And Juliet saw something new in his eyes. Not simple gratitude, not only duty. It was as though he were trying to understand the exact moment this tired woman in a plain dress had become essential to the fragile order of his world. He cleared his throat and turned slightly toward her. "Could you—" His voice stumbled, then steadied. "Could you ask a maid to take Anne inside? I would like to speak with you. Alone." Juliet's heart skipped a beat. There was nothing improper in the way he said it. And yet a quiet warning flared inside her. She called a maid, handed the girl over with instructions about the hot chocolate Anne had been promising herself since dawn, and stayed. The silence that followed was not comfortable. It wasn't hostile either. It was simply dense, like the air before a storm breaks. Joshua rested his hand on the fence, looking out at the fields for a moment before turning fully to her. "I ought to begin with something clever," he said, without a trace of irony. "But I fear I have nothing appropriate to offer." Juliet didn't smile. She didn't help him either. After a few seconds, he went on. "Since you came here, I've been trying to—" He searched for the word, as if it were hidden between the stable boards. "Sort out what I feel, and I am failing miserably." She kept her body still. Only her fingers tightened slightly on the wood. "My lord, if this is about my presence causing comments, I can leave as soon as we find a nurse for Anne to grow accustomed to. I know very well where I belong." His eyes narrowed, more in pain than anger. "This is not about what people will say," he answered. "Or rather it is, as it always is, but that isn't what I mean now." He drew a slow breath. "Juliet." Her name came out softer than he probably intended. "When I walked into that room and saw you with Anne in your arms, something in me shifted." He held her gaze, almost as if asking her permission to continue. "It wasn't just you. It wasn't only Anne. It was the idea, the sight of something I have been denied since I was a boy." The words landed like a silent blow. At 16, she would have heard them as the beginning of a promise. At 28, she knew better than to let herself believe such things. Even so, she could not pretend they didn't move her. "I understand," she said, her voice carefully steady, "at least part of it. But it is precisely because I understand that I must be cautious, my lord. I will not be merely the reflection of what you lacked." He was quiet for a long moment. "You think I don't know the difference?" he asked at last, low. "You think I don't understand that what I'm missing cannot be filled by any woman with a child in her arms?" There was no anger in it. Only weariness. "I don't know what you know," Juliet replied honestly. "I only know what life has taught me. When a person is in pain, it is very easy to cling to whoever happens to be near, and call that something else." He looked at her for several seconds, and to her surprise he did not retreat. "There is pain, yes," he admitted, "more than I care to confess. But it did not begin when you came into my life, Miss Juliet Weston." He paused briefly. "What began with you was movement." A short breath escaped him, almost a laugh stripped of humor. "This house was suspended," he said, "as if everyone here breathed only halfway, afraid to wake the ghosts. Since you arrived, I find I cannot pretend to be dead inside with the same efficiency." The words were not romantic. They were not pretty, but they were true. Juliet felt something loosen and tighten in her chest all at once. Because this was what terrified her, the possibility of being once more the point at which his path shifted, as she had been at 16, as she might be again. "I cannot be your salvation, Joshua." She used his name for the first time without a title. It sounded wrong and right all at once. "I can barely guarantee my own." He tilted his head slightly, as if recognizing the line she was drawing between them. "I did not ask you to save me," he replied, and there was something almost gentle buried deep in his voice. "I only do not want you to leave before I understand what, exactly, is changing." Juliet closed her eyes for a moment. It was a dangerously simple request. Stay. Stay a little longer. Stay long enough for her heart, long resigned to the safety of silence, to remember how it felt to beat for something more than mere survival. When she opened her eyes, he was still there, no closer. No farther. The same distance, the same abyss. "I cannot promise anything," she said at last. "Not to you, not to myself. I came for Anne. It is for her that I stay." He nodded slowly. "I know." His voice was a little rough. "And perhaps it is exactly for that reason that—" He cut himself off as if he had gone too far, then finished more carefully, "that I trust you more than I should." The silence that followed was not empty. It held every word neither of them dared to say. Joshua lifted his hand, not toward her but to the fence. A clumsy gesture from a man who almost reaches for support, then thinks better of it. "Let's go slowly," he murmured, as if answering something she hadn't been able to voice. "I have no wish to repeat youthful mistakes, not mine, not yours." Juliet couldn't decide if that hurt or calmed her, because that had been her deepest fear all along, that everything would again be too fast, too intense, too impossible. And yet what had broken her at 16 had not been intensity, it had been the cowardice of silence. Now at least there were words, imperfect, but spoken. She drew a breath. "Then, let it be slow," she agreed, almost in a whisper. "For Anne's sake. And for ours as well, I suppose." His expression changed so little that another observer might have missed it. But she didn't. A thread of relief. The faint outline of gratitude. A man who had spent a lifetime commanding an army of servants, now learning how to ask for something far more fragile. Time. Just a quiet agreement, forged there between straw and the smell of horse, under a pale autumn sky. They would walk along the edge of the precipice, slowly, one step at a time. Juliet returned to the house a little later, coat pulled up to her neck, thoughts in turmoil. In the nursery, she found Anne asleep in the armchair, a doll dropped at her side, small legs hanging at an awkward angle. The sight made Juliet's heart ache in a strange way, sweet and sharp at once. There it was, the impossible choice. To stay and risk becoming once more the almost in the life of a man who belonged to a world not her own. Or to leave too soon, and become just another memory the child would one day learn to push down into silence. Juliet knelt beside the chair and gently adjusted the girl's head against the back. She had no answers. Not yet. All she knew was that from this day forward, whichever path she chose would carry weight, for herself, for him, and above all, for the little girl who was beginning to trust her with the devastating simplicity of a child's love. Perhaps that was what it truly meant to feel again, after so many years. Not uncertainty itself, but the real undeniable weight of having to choose. Chapter 8. What Cannot Be Lost. Joshua Colborne could no longer clearly remember what life at Linfield Hall had been like before Juliet Weston walked through its gates. The change had not come as a sudden blow, but as a slow thaw. First, there were the sounds. The hard silence of the corridors gave way to small bursts of laughter drifting from the nursery. Then came Juliet's voice, steady, patient, teaching Anne to count on her fingers, to name colors, to say please and thank you, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. One morning, while straightening the curtains in the drawing room, Whitley remarked, in a tone far too neutral to be accidental, "The house seems lived in again, my lord." Joshua only nodded. He didn't trust his own voice. Linfield was no longer a mausoleum, and he knew exactly who had threaded life back through its halls. He began to notice the small traces of Juliet everywhere, napkins folded with care even when there were no guests expected, cushions arranged on the armchair where Anne liked to play, a small bunch of wildflowers in a plain vase, brightening a forgotten side table. Juliet had arrived at Linfield with very little, a few worn dresses, half a dozen books, and a quiet pride that made her refuse any offer of generosity she deemed excessive. When Mrs. Hargrave, following Joshua's discreet instruction, hinted at ordering new gowns, Juliet thanked her and declined. Joshua did not insist. He simply began to care for her in other ways. A casual comment at breakfast, Juliet mentioning that Anne loved stories with animals, resulted the next morning in 3 illustrated volumes waiting on the little table in the nursery. Juliet left a brief note on his desk. "Thank you for the books. Anne enjoyed them very much." Joshua filed the note away with his important documents, realizing only later how strange and how necessary that had felt. Soon, small acts began to flow in the other direction. One night, working late, Joshua found a cup of tea left quietly beside his papers. The next day, Juliet found a new shawl laid over the chair, where she usually read with Anne. Later, a pair of wool gloves appeared, wrapped in brown paper, with a short note. "Winter is coming." She never thanked him aloud, but he saw her crossing the courtyard wrapped in the shawl, and that was enough. Then came the night of the song. Passing through the corridor, Joshua heard Juliet singing softly to Anne. A simple melody, threaded with a gentle laugh that did not quite match the rigid woman who had arrived at the house weeks before. A sensible man would have kept walking. He stayed. He watched for a moment, an intimate scene that did not belong to him and yet struck him with an unexpected, almost painful force. The next day, everything slid back into its apparent routine. Anne running through the gardens, Juliet walking beside her, watchful, Joshua pretending to inspect the stables, yet increasingly unable to ignore the fact that, without his noticing, those two had already become part of his life. The servants began to notice as well. They didn't speak, at least not in front of him, but their glances met more often. The village, inevitably, would soon know that the widowed Viscount was sheltering under his roof a little bastard child and the woman who cared for her with near maternal devotion. And then, on an afternoon that seemed ordinary enough, the world tipped a little. Anne was running in the garden, chasing a lazy dog that Whitley tolerated, solely because the girl adored him. The ground was still damp from the previous night's rain. A single exposed root beneath the grass was all it took. The cry was sharp, short, sharp enough for Juliet to drop her embroidery on a garden bench and for Joshua to break off from a conversation with his steward. They both ran at the same time. The scene struck them in a single blow, Anne sitting on the ground, knee scraped, eyes filled with tears far too big for such a small hurt. Juliet reached her first, kneeling and pulling the girl into her lap with movements born of habit. "Shh, my love. It's just a scratch." Her voice was firm, but gentle. "You're a brave girl. You'll be all right." Anne clung to her neck as if the whole world were collapsing. Juliet cradled her with the ease of someone who had done this 1,000 times before. Joshua watched. He saw the raw trust in the child's grip. He saw the way Juliet held her, as though that small body marked the exact edge of the universe. He saw, for one terrible and luminous instant, something that looked too much like a family. A single word cut through him with brutal clarity. Mine. Not as possession, as belonging. He had to look away, just as he had so often at funerals, when the weight of the moment became nearly unbearable. Juliet looked up at him, still with Anne in her arms. "She'll be fine, my lord," she said, in a tone that balanced respect and a quiet familiarity. "Children fall, it isn't anyone's fault." The simplicity of that absolution, offered without the slightest idea of how deeply it reached, shifted something inside him. That night, Joshua tried to take refuge in the study, as he always had whenever he felt himself coming undone. It didn't work. The papers on his desk seemed meaningless, the letters blurred together, the neat columns of numbers refused to align. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the same picture, The damp garden, the crying child, Juliet's arms wrapped around her. He climbed the stairs later than usual, but his steps were steady, like a man marching into a battle he knew he could no longer avoid. He stopped at Juliet's door and knocked 3 times. She opened almost at once. She wore a shawl over her shoulders, her hair pinned up in haste, a few loose strands framing her face. She did not look frightened, only alert. "My lord?" He swallowed. "May I speak with you? In the library. It is important." She hesitated for a heartbeat. Not because of the potential scandal, a man and a woman alone at night, but because she sensed that after this conversation, nothing between them would ever be the same. Still, she nodded. The library was warm, lit by only a few candles. Joshua stood near the fireplace as if he needed the solidity of stone at his back to keep him upright. Juliet remained by the door, hands clasped before her, the posture of someone who might leave at any moment. "Has something happened to Anne?" she asked first, always to do with the child. "No." His reply came fast, firm. "She's well. Asleep." The silence that followed was brief but heavy. "It happened to me," he corrected quietly. "Or rather in me." Juliet didn't move. She tilted her head slightly, granting him the attention he was asking for without knowing how. "This last month," he drew a deep breath, like a man deciding to wade into icy water. "I've been telling myself your presence here is temporary, that you came for Anne, will stay for Anne, and will leave because of Anne. I have tried to keep everything orderly, at a distance." He paused. "I have failed miserably." He lifted a hand in a restrained gesture, as if reaching out only to pull back halfway. "Juliet, I spent years fleeing everything that reminded me how to feel, including you. I was a coward." The word landed heavy between them. "Today, when I saw Anne fall and saw you holding her, I understood all at once what I cannot afford to lose again." He took a few steps toward her, close enough for her to feel the warmth of him, but not close enough to touch. "Anne is already part of my life," he went on. "It's as if she were my daughter." His voice faltered slightly over "my daughter," a name he was still learning to claim. "And I do not want to lose her, just as I do not want to lose you, not again." Juliet drew a slow breath. "And what exactly are you asking of me?" Joshua swallowed. When he answered, it was with the bluntness of a man who had finally stopped circling the precipice. "Allow me to mend what I broke." His gaze held hers. "Not with pretty words, not with empty promises, with choices day after day. Allow me—" He hesitated, and the silence leaned forward with him. "To make you my wife." The last words hung between them, full of past and future at once. "Juliet Weston," he repeated, calmer now, as if setting each syllable into stone. "I am asking you to marry me, not for convenience, not to avoid scandal, not out of pity, but because among all that I have lost and all that I might still build, you are the one thing I am not willing to let slip through my hands again." She closed her eyes for a moment, as though she needed to sort through everything that now beat louder than her own heart. The old letters never sent, that long-ago ball, the quiet humiliation, the years spent in other people's houses, her arrival at this estate with almost nothing. Everything seemed to gather into this single point. "Joshua," she began, her voice rough, but he lifted a hand in a silent plea. "I am not asking you to forget what I did," he said softly, "only to let me prove I am no longer that man, that I have learned the difference between duty and cowardice, that this time I will not run." The name for what stood between them might have been love. It might have been redemption. Perhaps it was both. Juliet opened her eyes. Tears glimmered there, not of despair, but of recognition. "I cannot promise I will never be afraid," she confessed, "or that I'll forget what happened when I was 16, but I can promise you this: I know my worth now, and I would accept nothing less than a man willing to stay." He drew in a sharp breath. "And I am that man," he answered, with a simplicity that hurt. The silence that followed was not empty. It was dense, full of choices already made and those still waiting. Juliet felt the weight of 12 years on her shoulders, and beneath that weight something new, light, almost frightening. Hope. Then, she murmured at last, in a thread of a voice that somehow filled the room, "Yes, I will marry you." It was not an easy yes, not a quick one. It was a yes grown out of loss, solitude, and long waiting. A yes that knew the danger, and chose it anyway. Joshua closed his eyes for an instant, as if bracing against the tide rising inside him. Then he stepped forward and took her hands, not as a man claiming a possession, but as someone entrusted with something precious. He drew her into an embrace. It was not a heated embrace, it was firm, whole, almost reverent. Juliet rested her forehead against his shoulder and heard Joshua's heart pounding far too fast for a man so practiced at control. For the first time since she had left her modest house with a small trunk and a child in her arms, Juliet no longer felt she was walking alone. A family did not yet exist in full, not officially, not in the eyes of society. But here, within these walls that were learning to breathe again, something essential had been chosen. What could not be lost had finally been claimed. Chapter 9. A Home Found. The days that followed his proposal were strange in a way Juliet didn't have a name for. Not strange in a painful sense. Strange in the sense of new. As if she had woken up inside a life that was not yet fully hers, and yet fit her better than any other she had ever worn. Joshua had not turned into another man overnight. He was still reserved. He still disappeared into his study for hours. He still stumbled over public displays of affection, as though every gesture had to fight its way through years of habit before surfacing. But something in him had changed. Juliet, who had spent years learning how to be invisible, now felt seen. Alarmingly, deeply, beautifully seen. 3 days after the conversation in the library, Joshua came to her again. It wasn't night. The sun was still high, pouring gold over the gardens. Juliet was crouched beside a flower bed, helping Anne tell the difference between rosebuds and weeds when she heard footsteps on the gravel. Joshua was coming toward them with that contained air she now recognized as nerves. "Juliet," he said, and her name in his mouth no longer sounded like simple courtesy. "Would you come with me? I need to show you something." She called a maid to stay with Anne and followed him inside, her heart beating a little faster than she cared to admit. On the mahogany desk in his study lay a sealed letter, ready to be sent. "To the vicar," he explained, resting his hands on the wood as if he needed its steadiness, asking him to have the banns read next Sunday. The air seemed to thin around her. 3 weeks, he went on, lifting his gaze to hers. "That's the required time. After that," a brief pause heavy with expectation, "after that you will be my wife if you still wish it. If you still wish it." She almost laughed, not at the words themselves, but at the absurd idea that he thought there might be hesitation left in her. "I do," she said, her voice steady even as her fingers trembled. "But Joshua, society, people will talk, they'll judge." "Let them," he answered, with a hardness that held no coldness, only resolve. "They'll talk for 3 whole weeks, and perhaps for months after. In the end, they'll grow used to it or they won't." He shrugged, with a calm that felt almost defiant. "It will not change what we are. You will be my wife. They may choose whether to accept it or not. We do not need their permission." Juliet looked at the letter, small, simple, and absolute. "Then send it," she murmured. "Before I lose my courage." He walked around the desk, came close, and took her face gently between his hands. "You are the bravest woman I know," he said, with a conviction that brought color to her cheeks. "And I intend to spend the rest of my life reminding you of that." The first week after the announcement was merciless. The banns were read on Sunday in the little village church. Juliet felt every word as if a bell were ringing inside her chest, calling everyone to witness what until then had belonged only to her and Joshua. By the next morning the letters began to arrive. Some were polite and cold, filled with hollow congratulations that said nothing at all. Others didn't bother to hide their disdain. Some criticized Joshua for lowering himself to marry a woman of obscure circumstances. Others hinted that Juliet was seeking an easy rise. One letter in particular was left in the tray of correspondence in Juliet's room. Someone, perhaps thinking they were helping, had decided she should see it herself. She sat on the edge of the bed, broke the seal, and read. The handwriting was elegant, the content poisonous. It spoke of interest, of convenience, of taking advantage of a widower's loneliness. When she finished, Juliet's face felt cold, her palms damp. From the outside, her story really could look suspect. A poor governess, a widowed viscount, an orphaned child in need of a mother. It could all be interpreted as arrangement, calculation, something built on need and convenience, not love. What if that is how they always see it? A voice whispered inside her. What if, deep down, that is what I am? She was still holding the crushed letter when someone knocked at the door. Joshua came in almost at once, as if something had drawn him there with urgency. He saw the paper, saw her face. He didn't ask. He took the letter from her hands, read it quickly, and his jaw clenched line by line. Without a word, he walked to the fireplace, opened the screen, and tossed the paper into the flames. He stood beside her, while the fire devoured every stroke of ink. Words, he said at last, his voice firm but low. Only words written by someone who has never seen us from the inside, someone who has no idea what you've done for Anne, and for me. Do not let it touch you. Juliet tried to smile, tried to believe him. It's hard, she admitted in a thin voice, when you've had so little. It's easy to think they might be right, that it does look that way, that I'm only trying to cling to something that doesn't belong to me. Joshua knelt in front of her, holding her hands with grave reverence. You belong here more than anyone who ever wrote such things, he said. If anyone dares to say you are here out of convenience, remember this. The only convenience I had for most of my life was cowardice, and you were the one who broke that. She closed her eyes, letting his words wash over her like warm water. Even so, when he left and silence settled again, the ghost of that letter remained. In the quiet spaces between tasks, in the moments when no voice filled the hours, she found herself repeating those cruel lines in her head. For days, their words tangled with her own. Love, interest, convenient, choice. The wound was still raw when salvation arrived, simple, disarming, impossible to argue with. In the second week, Joshua did something that surprised even Juliet. He announced at the breakfast table that they were going into the village, all three of them, together. To choose fabric for your wedding dress, he added, buttering his bread with the ease of someone commenting on the weather. Juliet almost dropped her spoon. Joshua, that isn't necessary. Mrs. Hargrave can speak to a seamstress, she began. He cut her off, gentle but immovable. I want to, he said. He met her eyes, and she knew this was not mere kindness. It was a decision. You are the bride. I am the man who chose you, and Anne is under my protection. Let the village see us exactly as we are. Her stomach knotted. Going into the village with him would already be a spectacle. Going with him and Anne to choose wedding fabric was more than an errand. It was a statement, a challenge, a quiet affront to everything they expected from a viscount. She took a breath. Very well, she said with a small nod. Let us go to the village, then. The village practically stopped when Linfield's carriage rolled onto the main street. Shopkeepers stepped into their doorways. Some women pretended to rearrange displays just to watch more closely. Men paused their conversations and lifted their hats, unsure whether to smile or not. Juliet felt every gaze land on her like a stone. The old feeling of not belonging rose tight in her throat. Joshua stepped down first, then helped Anne, and finally offered his hand to Juliet. He didn't rush the gesture. He didn't try to make it discreet. On the contrary, he held her hand a fraction longer than necessary, as if presenting her to the world at his side. They walked together into the fabric shop, a simple but well-kept place. Juliet knew that under other circumstances, A man of his rank could simply send for a modiste from London or have bolts of silk delivered to the estate without ever leaving. But he had chosen the village, the shop any ordinary woman could enter, the place where everyone could see. "May I help you, my lord?" the shopkeeper asked, voice slightly unsteady. "My fiancée needs fabric for her wedding dress," Joshua said, without embellishment. "I would like the finest you have." Heat rushed to Juliet's cheeks. My fiancé. There was no way to soften that. She chose ivory silk. Simple. Elegant. Without excess. Something that suited the life she had lived and the woman she was, not the show others might imagine she wanted beside a title. The shopkeeper hesitated, glancing from Juliet to Joshua, as if expecting him to reconsider. He took out the coins and laid them on the counter with deliberate calm. "For my future wife," he said, clearly enough that two men loitering at the door, pretending to watch the horses, could hear. Something inside Juliet settled into place. On the ride back, the village's murmurs felt distant. Not because they had vanished, but because for the first time she felt she had stood beside him in front of the world, not behind him. That night at Linfield Hall, Juliet was sitting by the window mending the hem of one of Anne's dresses, when she heard a soft knock. "Come in," she called. Joshua stepped inside, more hesitant than usual. In his hands was a small, dark blue velvet box. "I brought you something," he murmured, closing the door behind him. She set the sewing in her lap. He walked over and opened the box. Inside lay a ring. Fine gold with a small diamond. Not a wedding band. Something older, more intimate. Something with a story. "It was my mother's," Joshua said, his voice a little rough. "My father gave it to her when they married. She wore it every day. When she died, I kept it. I considered giving it to Catherine, but somehow, at the time, it felt wrong." He lifted his eyes to Juliet's. "With you, it doesn't. It feels inevitable." He took her hand, his thumb brushing her skin with almost reverent care. "If you'll accept it," he added, softer now. "I would like you to wear it until the wedding, and after, if you wish. It isn't just an ornament. It's a place I'm offering you, a place in my family's story." Tears pricked Juliet's eyes. All her life, it had felt as if there was no place that truly belonged to her. She was always a guest, a substitute, a temporary presence. And now this man was placing in her hand the most intimate symbol of his mother, the deepest link to his past. She held out her hand, trembling. The ring slid onto her finger as if it had been waiting for her. "Thank you," she whispered, "for choosing me, for making me feel I belong somewhere." Joshua bent and pressed a kiss to her forehead, then to her hair. "You are worth everything," he murmured against her skin, "and I will spend the rest of my life proving it." The wedding took place a week later, simple and quiet, as if the day itself understood it was not witnessing a spectacle, but a reunion. In the little stone church, with light streaming through coloured glass and Anne gripping Juliet's hand with fierce determination, they exchanged vows before the vicar and a handful of servants who could barely hide their emotion. When Joshua slipped the band onto her finger, Juliet felt, for the first time in her life, that she was stepping not into duty, but into home. And when he laced his fingers through hers and smiled, brief, sincere, she knew no letter, written or burned, could ever define what they had chosen. She was his wife now, and he was at last her place in the world. Epilogue. 6 months later. Juliet sat at the writing desk in their room, the room that was now theirs, not only his, with a blank sheet of paper before her and a pen between her fingers. Afternoon sunlight poured through the window in soft golden bands, and outside she could hear Anne's laughter drifting in from the gardens. Joshua was with the little girl, teaching her to ride on her own on the small pony he had bought 3 weeks after the wedding. The sight had become so common, so woven into the rhythm of their days, that Juliet could almost forget the silence that had ruled this place only half a year earlier. She looked at the paper and thought of that old letter. the one she had received so many years ago, cold and formal, summoning her to bring Anne. Juliet had kept that paper not out of bitterness, but as a reminder of where she had come from, of how empty her life had been, and of how a few spare lines had opened doors she had once believed forever closed. The letter before her now, however, was not a summons, not a farewell. It was an ending, a quiet entry in a private journal, a conversation with the past. Juliet bent over the page and began to write. Dear life, I almost never lived. Thank you for being hard. For teaching me how to survive alone, how to stand up when everything fell apart, how to find dignity even when the world insisted I did not deserve it. Because without that strength, I would not be here now. I would not be able to love without fear. I would not believe I deserved this. Thank you for breaking me. It was through the cracks that the light came in. I know now I do not have to be whole to be loved. I can be scars and hope at the same time. I can be past and future. I can be who I was and who I have yet to become. And thank you, above all, for bringing me to him, to Joshua, to Anne, to this place I can finally call home. The words seemed to linger in the air. Juliet set down the pen, glanced away from the page, and realized she was crying, not from sorrow but from peace, from closure. She folded the letter carefully and placed it in the drawer beside the old one, the letter that had summoned her, the letter that had set her free. And she understood clearly, gently, definitively, that she did not need to send this second letter anywhere. There was no longer any emptiness to fill. On the far side of the gardens, Joshua watched Anne ride in careful circles within the small enclosed paddock. 6 months of marriage, and he still sometimes woke expecting to see the familiar emptiness that had lain beside him for 4 years. But he found Juliet. Always Juliet, sleeping with a serenity she had not possessed in those first weeks at Linfield Hall, when every sound woke her and every glance made her tense. Now she slept deeply, like someone who had finally found solid ground. To Joshua that was worth more than any title or estate. "Papa, look, all by myself," Anne called, radiant. Papa. The word still struck him every time. Not my lord, not Uncle Joshua. Papa, spoken with such simple certainty that he sometimes had to pause just to breathe. He lifted a hand and waved, smiling. "Very good, my love. You're becoming an excellent rider." Anne laughed, her fair curls flying in the wind. Something warm and solid settled in his chest. Unexpected, precious, family. He looked up and saw Juliet at the window watching them. Even from a distance he felt the gentle weight of her gaze. Love, trust, belonging. And he knew, as he knew every morning, that he had chosen rightly. Later, when Anne was asleep and the house had sunk into a gentle, comfortable quiet, Joshua found Juliet in their room. She stood at the open window, hair loose over her shoulders, wearing a simple nightgown and the shawl he had given her months ago, not out of need, but because it meant something, because it was part of their story. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, wrapping his arms around her from behind. "About how it was before," Juliet murmured, "and how it is now. How everything has changed, and yet somehow feels as if it should always have been this way." Joshua rested his chin on the top of her head. "I'm afraid sometimes," he confessed quietly, "afraid I'll wake up and find it was only a dream, that you're not really here." Juliet turned in his arms and cupped his face gently in her hands. "I am here," she said, steady and sure. "And I'm not going anywhere." They kissed with quiet tenderness, like two people sealing a promise they no longer needed to speak aloud. When they parted, Juliet said, "I wrote a letter today, to the life I almost never lived, thanking it, forgiving it, closing a circle." Joshua drew her closer, holding her just a little tighter. "And what did you say?" he asked. "That it was worth it," Juliet whispered. "All the pain, all the waiting. All 12 years since the day we walked away from each other, because in the end they brought me to you." Emotion rose in his throat. "Then I'll write my own," Joshua said, his voice low. "Thanking life for letting me live long enough, even in my cowardice, for me to grow into a man worthy of you. If I'd chosen you at 22, I wouldn't have had the maturity to understand this, or to value you as you deserve. Juliet closed her eyes, moved by the honesty of his regret. His hand drifted to her stomach, fingertips resting there in a gesture almost unconscious, almost shy, but full of future. "We have so much still ahead of us," Joshua murmured. "Anne, and perhaps others who may come. This house will never be empty again." A gentle warmth spread through Juliet, not only at the possibility itself, but at the way he spoke in the plural, as if tomorrow already belonged to them. Outside, night settled over Linfield Hall. Stars pricked through the deep blue sky one by one. Hours later, when the house finally gave in to sleep, 3 people lay resting, a family, imperfect, patched together, born from ruins, yet whole in love, and for the first time, with a calm, steady glimpse of what they might yet become. Before sleep claimed her in Joshua's arms, Juliet thought of the letter tucked away in the drawer. She did not need to send it. There was nothing left to ask for, no hollow space left inside her. She had everything. She had a home. She had love. She had Joshua. She had Anne. And maybe, someday, in a future that no longer frightened her, she would have more. And for the first time in 28 years, 6 of which she had survived drifting from house to house, and 12 since the day she lost him, Juliet Colborne closed her eyes without fearing the morning, because morning now had a face, it had a name, it had a promise, and she was no longer alone. She never would be again. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you enjoyed this story, please remember to give it a like and subscribe to the channel. Your support means the world to me, and it helps new stories come to life.